For decades, Western media think tanks and politicians have claimed that China abandoned socialism and embraced capitalism. But what if that's a myth? China is a country that often confounds the Western imagination. The Western political establishment describes it as a communist dictatorship. Meanwhile, Western investors speak of its capitalist dynamism. One day, it's a repressive state. The next, it's the land of opportunity for global capital. But rarely is the truth about China's economic system understood in its complexity. The confusion is not accidental. It's the product of decades of ideological distortion, geopolitical rivalry, and economic illiteracy at the highest levels of Western analysis. What the West struggles to comprehend is that China has developed a unique model, a socialist market economy designed not by abandoning Marxism, but by adapting it. This model is not capitalist, nor is it a carbon copy of the old Soviet command economy. It is a hybrid system in which markets exist but are enclosed within the boundaries set by a powerful and centralized socialist state. And this misunderstanding is not trivial, because behind the myths and distortions lies a very real fear that China has built a system that works efficiently, coherently, and on its own terms. One that has produced the largest poverty alleviation campaign in human history. One that has industrialized in record time. And one that increasingly threatens to offer an alternative to the neoliberal model imposed on much of the world since the end of the Cold War. Let us go back to the roots. When Mao Zedong led the Chinese Communist Party to victory in 1949, China was among the poorest nations on earth. Life expectancy was barely 32 years. The population was overwhelmingly rural, largely illiterate, scarred by a century of foreign occupation, internal feudalism, and civil war. The new government inherited a country with almost no modern infrastructure, no significant industry, and no national banking system. The first 3 decades of communist rule were dedicated to revolutionary transformation, land reform, collectivization, mass education, public health, and industrial foundation. These were not perfect years. Mistakes were made. But the Mao era created the material and institutional platform on which all subsequent development was built. By the late 1970s, however, China faced a dilemma. The country had stabilized politically and socially, but economically it remained far behind. Most Chinese were still poor farmers. Industrial productivity was low, consumer goods were scarce, growth was stagnant. Deng Xiaoping, who emerged as the new leader after Mao's death, faced a critical question: how to accelerate development without abandoning socialism. The answer was what came to be known as the reform and opening up policy. It was not, as often portrayed in Western media, a turn to capitalism. Deng Xiaoping himself was clear. China would maintain socialism, but introduce market mechanisms as tools to develop the productive forces. His famous saying, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice," was not a renunciation of ideology, but a declaration of pragmatism. But pragmatism did not mean surrender. Deng also emphasized that the commanding heights of the economy, the critical sectors that determine national sovereignty, industrial capability, and macroeconomic stability, must remain under state control. These included banking, heavy industry, energy, transportation, telecommunications, and land. And decades later, they still are. Unlike in the West, where privatization became a dogma and public assets were sold off in the name of efficiency, China retained and even expanded its state-owned enterprises, especially in strategic sectors. Today, these SOEs are not relics of a bygone era. They are central to China's development. They build highways, manage airports, extract resources, control financial flows, and lead key technological sectors. They exist not to maximize shareholder profit, but to fulfill national priorities and ensure economic resilience. Let's talk numbers. In 2022, 136 of the Fortune Global 500 companies were Chinese. The vast majority of them, over 70%, were SOEs. These enterprises accounted for 78% of China's revenue in the top 500 and held 84% of the assets. These are not marginal institutions. They are the economic backbone of the nation. And their size and reach are growing, not shrinking. This brings us to a fundamental difference between China's system and the capitalist economies of the West. The purpose of ownership. In capitalism, ownership exists to extract profit. In China, ownership, especially public ownership, is a tool to guide development, stabilize the economy, and meet public needs. Profitability is not irrelevant, but it is not sovereign. And this orientation is why China's government continues to guide credit, investment, and resource allocation through tools like state-owned banks, regulatory agencies, and 5-year plans. Markets exist. Private businesses exist. Competition exists. But all of these are subject to the overarching authority of the Communist Party and its long-term vision. Let us pause here and consider a powerful metaphor: the birdcage economy, coined by Chen Yun, one of China's key economic reformers. He argued that the market is like a bird. It must be free to fly, but within a cage. The cage is the state, sets the limits. It decides when to tighten or loosen control. The bird can help feed the people, but it must not fly away. This metaphor defines China's system better than any Western textbook ever could. The reforms of the 1990s under Jiang Zemin further elaborated this model. During this period, China consolidated its large SOEs under tighter state control, while allowing small, non-strategic enterprises like restaurants, textile factories, or hotels to be privatized. This policy became known as grasp the large, let go of the small. The state retained control over sectors deemed essential to national development, while allowing market forces to play a larger role in peripheral areas. This balance between state and market, between planning and competition, created a unique model that defies Western categories. It is not neoliberal. It is not Soviet-style command planning. It is a system rooted in Marxist principles, but adapted to the realities of the 21st century. Let's turn to poverty alleviation. Since the 1980s, China has lifted over 800 million people out of extreme poverty. It's nearly 3/4 of all global poverty reduction during that period. No capitalist country, not even with free market structural adjustment or World Bank loans, has achieved anything remotely similar. And yet Western pundits still claim that China succeeded because it adopted capitalism. This narrative collapses under scrutiny. If capitalism alone was the magic formula, then why haven't other capitalist countries, many in the global south, produced similar outcomes? Haiti, the Philippines, Honduras, and Sudan are all capitalist. Their economies are open, their markets are free, yet their populations remain poor. The real difference is not in ideology, but in control. In China, the state retains control over capital. In the West, capital controls the state. This core distinction between a state that governs markets and one governed by markets reveals itself most clearly when we examine how each system handles the financial sector. In the West, finance is the beating heart of the economy. Everything revolves around Wall Street. Government policy is often crafted not to benefit the people, but to maintain investor confidence, stabilize the stock market, and ensure capital gains for the wealthy. Politicians cheer when stock indexes rise and panic when they fall. The American Federal Reserve, the central bank of the world's largest capitalist economy, routinely injects trillions of dollars into financial markets, not to build factories or improve wages but to inflate asset prices. Meanwhile, in China, financial markets exist, but they are not sacred. They do not rule the economy. They do not dictate policy. They are tools, not masters. Let's look at the numbers. Since 1980, China's GDP measured at purchasing power parity has grown more than 100-fold. It now surpasses the United States in size, according to IMF data. And yet, during that same time, China's main stock market index, the CSI 500, has remained stagnant. Foreign investors regularly complain about how difficult it is to profit in Chinese equities. Unlike the S&P 500 or Nasdaq, which have ballooned beyond rational valuations due to decades of speculative fever, China's markets remain tightly controlled and often underwhelming to global finance. This is not an accident. It is by design. China's economy is not powered by stock buybacks, venture capital hype, or inflated tech bubbles. It is powered by credit issued by state-owned banks, by infrastructure investment, and by strategic industrial policy. If a Chinese company needs capital to expand, it doesn't go to Wall Street, it goes to the China Development Bank. The Agricultural Bank of China, or the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, all of which are state-owned, and all of which direct lending according to national priorities. The four largest banks in the world, measured by total assets, are all Chinese and all state-owned. Together they manage over $20 trillion in assets. And these banks lend not for speculation but for production. They fund electric vehicles, rail networks, housing, semiconductors, and renewable energy. They are instruments of industrial development, not casinos for speculative capital. This helps explain another stark contrast. In the U.S., private companies spend more than 90% of their earnings on stock buybacks and dividends. That is, they enrich their shareholders, usually the wealthy, rather than reinvesting in new equipment, worker training, or innovation. This is one of the core symptoms of a financialized economy. Short-term profit is prioritized over long-term development. In China, this kind of behavior is not tolerated. Companies that engage in excessive speculation, risky debt accumulation, or attempts to circumvent state control are punished often harshly. The case of Evergrande, a massive real estate developer that collapsed under its own debt, is a case in point. Rather than bail it out and socialize the losses like the U.S. did with its banks in 2008, the Chinese state let it fall. Why? Because China does not exist to protect billionaires. And that brings us to another critical myth. Many Western analysts argue that the presence of billionaires in China is proof of capitalism. But this is a fallacy. The question is not whether billionaires exist, but how they are treated. In the United States, billionaires often write legislation through lobbying, by politicians through donations, and evade accountability through legal loopholes. In China, the opposite is true. If a billionaire in China breaks the law, they go to jail. If they attempt to build shadow banking empires that rival the authority of the state, they are dismantled. If they promote inequality through privatized education, housing speculation, or exploitative lending, their companies are regulated or closed. Jack Ma, once China's richest man, learned this lesson when his fintech empire Ant Group was halted by regulators and partially dismantled. His attempt to privatize lending and create parallel financial structures ran directly into the authority of the Communist Party, and the party won. And it is appropriate to say, billionaires should not exist. However, the position in which they are located in relation to power says everything about the economic system. This isn't about vendettas, it's about priorities. In China, capital must serve the state. In the U.S., the state serves capital. And that's the fundamental contradiction that the Western establishment refuses to acknowledge. They ask, how can China be socialist if it has a stock market? But the answer is simple. The stock market in China is not central. It's peripheral. The state retains control over the levers of capital allocation. The real economy, production, wages, infrastructures, not dictated by share price, but by planning and policy. That's why China has succeeded where capitalist economies have failed. That's why it has built the most extensive high-speed rail network in the world, while the U.S. can't maintain its bridges. That's why it builds entire cities in a decade, while American housing collapses into crisis. That's why Chinese wages have grown dramatically in manufacturing, while American wages have stagnated for 40 years. Critics will say this comes at a cost. Restrictions on political rights, censorship, centralization, and those criticisms should be taken seriously. No system is perfect. But we must also ask, what are the costs of Western capitalism? What is the cost of privatizing everything? Of allowing billionaires to dictate policy? Of tying human well-being to the rise and fall of speculative markets? Today, the richest 10% of Americans own 93% of all U.S. stocks. The bottom 50% of Americans own just 1%. In China, only around 10% of people own stocks at all, and most are already wealthy. That's why the government does not prioritize stock market growth. It does not see it as a barometer of public well-being. It sees it as a tool, nothing more. And while the U.S. has financialized its economy to the point of cannibalism, China has retained its industrial base. Manufacturing remains the core of its economy. It exports goods. It builds things. It produces steel, solar panels, computers, and cars. This is not accidental, it is policy. That policy is rooted in the belief that the economy should serve the people, not the other way around. There's a term often used by Chinese policymakers, common prosperity. It is not about eliminating all inequality, but about ensuring that growth is broadly shared. And that means cracking down on sectors that exacerbate inequality, private education, speculative housing, unregulated finance, and promoting sectors that create jobs, raise incomes, and meet basic needs. This is socialism, not in the form of slogans, but in the structure of the economy. And who owns the means of production, in how credit is allocated, in who benefits from growth, and in what role the state plays in shaping the future. Let's now look at how China's approach to currency, trade, and capital controls reveals even more about its model. One of the least understood and most important features of China's socialist system is its management of currency, trade, and capital flows. These areas are not just technical, they reflect fundamental choices about sovereignty and economic independence. China has long resisted the push to fully liberalize its capital account. That means money cannot freely flow in and out of the country the way it does in open capitalist economies. There is no Chinese equivalent of Wall Street hedge funds moving billions of dollars in and out in seconds. Foreign capital is allowed in, but only under rules set by the state. The People's Bank of China, which is the central bank, does not act independently of the government. It coordinates directly with the leadership of the Communist Party. This is critical, because in neoliberal economies, independent central banks act as guardians of the financial class, managing inflation, protecting investor confidence, and often doing so at the expense of wages, employment, and public services. China rejects this model. Its central bank is a political tool, subject to national priorities. It adjusts interest rates not to appease capital markets, but to stimulate or cool down sectors based on development goals. The Chinese yuan, or renminbi, is also tightly managed. China does not allow it to float freely on global markets. Instead, it maintains an exchange rate regime that protects industrial competitiveness and resists currency speculation. In other words, China's monetary policy is designed to serve workers and producers, not currency traders and financial speculators. This is especially important in the global context. In the 1980s, Japan was pressured by the United States into signing the Plaza Accord, which dramatically appreciated the yen. The result? Japanese exports became less competitive. Asset bubbles inflated. And by the early 1990s, the economy collapsed into what came to be known as the lost decades. China watched that collapse carefully and learned with it. It learned that currency sovereignty must be protected, that financial liberalization can be fatal, that capital controls are not a weakness, they're a shield. And this is where China's development path diverges sharply from that of the US and its allies. The US dollar is not just a currency, it is a weapon. It allows Washington to control global finance, to sanction enemies, to enforce political obedience through access to SWIFT, to block development through IMF structural adjustment. But China is challenging this system. Slowly, methodically, it is building alternatives. It has promoted the international use of the yuan, created a cross-border payment system, and signed bilateral trade agreements denominated in its own currency. It has led the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the BRICS New Development Bank. These are not isolated moves. They're steps toward a de-dollarized world in which financial sovereignty is no longer monopolized by a declining empire. Let's return to the internal logic of China's economy. Many Western economists remain obsessed with China's supposed failure to grow its stock market. They argue that because Chinese equities remain underperforming, the system is flawed. But this logic only holds if you assume that the stock market is the economy. It isn't. China's GDP has exploded in the past 4 decades. Life expectancy has risen from the low 30s to nearly 80 years higher than that of the United States. Literacy is nearly universal. High-speed rail crisscrosses the country. Industrial output has made China the manufacturing capital of the world. The real economy, the one that produces goods, builds infrastructure, educates children, and employs people, is thriving. Meanwhile, in the US, financialization has hollowed out the real economy. Private equity firms dismantle productive companies to extract value. Real estate becomes a speculative asset, pricing out working-class families. Venture capital flows to surveillance apps and online gambling, not to steel mills or semiconductor factories. And all the while, the working class watches its wealth stagnate, its jobs disappear, its communities collapse. This is the model that Western elites insist China must adopt. This is the system they call freedom. But China's not buying it. It's resisting the siren song of neoliberalism. And its resistance is producing results. Nowhere is this clearer than in the way China manages the relationship between labor and capital. In capitalist societies, the profits of capital are paramount. The goal is to maximize shareholder returns. Workers are a cost to be minimized. That's why wages have stagnated in the US and Europe for decades even, as productivity increased and stock markets soared. The gains from growth went overwhelmingly to the top 1%. But in China, the political system is explicitly designed to favor labor over capital. That doesn't mean there's no inequality, but it does mean that policy is oriented toward wage growth, job creation, and industrial upgrading, not shareholder value. This is visible in a number of ways. First, wages in China's manufacturing sector have risen rapidly. Once known for cheap labor, China now pays factory workers several times more than neighboring countries like Vietnam, Thailand, or the Philippines. This is not accidental. It's part of the state's strategy to climb the value chain, to move from low-cost assembly to high-tech production. Second, Chinese stimulus policies tend to prioritize infrastructure and production after the 2008 global financial crisis. For example, China launched a massive stimulus, not to bail out banks, but to build railroads, ports, housing, and factories. The US, by contrast, bailed out Wall Street and let millions of families lose their homes. Third, China's taxation and fiscal system are increasingly oriented toward redistribution. Billionaires are not untouchable. In fact, they've been losing wealth in recent years as the state cracks down on speculation, monopoly behavior, and regulatory evasion. Sectors like private tutoring, which were worsening inequality in education, have been heavily restricted, and this reflects a deeper ideological commitment. In China, the state is not neutral. It takes sides, and it has chosen to side with the working class, at least in structure, if not always in rhetoric. This is not something any Western capitalist state can credibly claim. And even when China allows private companies to grow like Alibaba, Tencent, or BYD, it ensures that they remain subordinate to the state. Through a system of golden shares, regulatory control, and political discipline, the Communist Party retains decisive influence. If these firms try to challenge that authority, they are brought to heel. Western media frames this as authoritarianism, but from another perspective, it is simply democratic economic planning, the idea that no private actor should be allowed to undermine the collective interest. This brings us to a final but crucial point: the philosophy behind China's economy. While the U.S. measures economic health by the Dow Jones and S&P 500, China uses broader indicators: GDP growth, wage levels, poverty rates, infrastructure coverage, technology transfer, and social stability. The goal is not to enrich the top 1%, but to build a society that is materially stable, strategically independent, and socially cohesive. Of course, contradictions remain. Inequality still exists. Corruption is a constant threat. Environmental degradation has been a challenge, though improvements are underway. But the model itself of state-led socialist-oriented production-centered development has proven resilient, and the West cannot ignore this any longer. The real dilemma the West now faces is not whether China is authoritarian or democratic, capitalist or socialist. The real dilemma is that China's system works and it's not Western. That is what unsettles think tanks in Washington, editorial boards in London, and financial analysts in New York. Because they have built entire careers on the dogma that capitalism is the only viable path, that private ownership, free markets, and minimal government intervention are not just ideal, they're inevitable. But China challenges that assumption at every level. It shows that industrial policy still works, that strategic planning can outperform the chaos of markets, that banking doesn't need to be privatized, that housing, transport, and energy can be publicly owned without falling into collapse. That development is not the result of deregulation, but of discipline, direction, and design. And this challenge has created a crisis of legitimacy for the West, because for decades, the US-led model was exported across the globe under the banner of reform. Countries were told, Privatize your industries. Liberalize your markets. Open your capital accounts. Cut public spending and adopt electoral democracy. This was called the Washington Consensus, and it became the default setting of globalization. But what did it deliver? In Latin America, it led to economic stagnation, foreign debt, and social unrest. In Africa, it gutted state capacity and locked countries into extractive dependencies. In Eastern Europe, it turned public wealth into oligarchic fortunes and unleashed decades of demographic decline. And even in the heart of the empire, the United States itself, real wages have barely budged since the 1970s. Inequality has soared. Infrastructure has decayed. Public trust has collapsed. Now compare that to China. Since 1978, China's GDP has grown at an average of nearly 10% per year. Over 800 million people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. Life expectancy now exceeds that of the United States. China leads the world in infrastructure development, green technology, 5G deployment, and industrial upgrading. And all of this was achieved not by copying the West, but by rejecting its orthodoxy. This is the real reason behind the U.S. trade war, behind the bans on Huawei, behind the hysteria over TikTok, behind the desperate efforts to prevent China from producing advanced semiconductors. It is not about national security, it is about ideological insecurity. Because the rise of China exposes a fundamental truth, that capitalism is not the only system that can deliver growth, and that socialism, if implemented pragmatically, can outperform it. This truth is so dangerous to Western elites that it must be denied at all costs. That's why China is constantly painted as a threat, a dictatorship, a manipulator. That's why Western media rarely covers its development, achievements, its policy innovations, or its global partnerships. And when they do, it is always with a tone of suspicion, never curiosity. But beyond the smokescreen, a new world is emerging. Today, countries across the global south are watching China not as a threat, but as a partner. China builds roads, bridges, hospitals, and railways not only in Asia, but in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. It offers development loans without political strings. It builds schools instead of military bases. It doesn't overthrow governments for refusing U.S. investment. It creates alternatives. It's the heart of the Belt and Road Initiative, a global infrastructure. Programs spanning more than 140 countries. Critics call it debt trap diplomacy. But for many developing nations, it's the first time in history they've had access to infrastructure financing that isn't tied to Western domination. And while some projects have faced setbacks or criticism, the overarching result is undeniable. China is reshaping global development. But it's not just the global south that is waking up. Even within the West, cracks are forming in the neoliberal consensus. From declining life expectancy in the U.S. to mounting student debt, unaffordable housing, mass shootings, and the collapse of public health, ordinary people are losing faith. More and more are questioning why the richest country on earth cannot provide basic services. While China builds entire cities in less time than it takes to approve a subway extension in New York, this comparison is not about glorifying China or excusing its shortcomings. It is about recognizing a fact that the U.S. model is in decay and the Chinese model is rising, not because it is perfect, but because it is designed to serve the people, not capital. Let us consider what that really means. In the United States, nearly 70% of people live paycheck to paycheck. Over half of Americans cannot afford a $500 emergency expense. Meanwhile, the wealthiest 1% control more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Billionaires have increased their fortunes by trillions during global crises, while workers are told to tighten their belts. Cities collapse into homelessness and despair, while banks receive trillion-dollar bailouts. This is the system that lectures the world about freedom. But what is freedom in a system where healthcare bankrupts you, where education indebts you for life, where public services are privatized, neighborhoods are gentrified, and democracy is auctioned off to the highest bidder? This is not freedom. It is serfdom with credit cards. Now compare this to China. While inequality certainly exists, it is actively managed. The state intervenes to curb speculative bubbles. It imposes wealth redistribution through taxation and state-owned infrastructure. It delivers healthcare to hundreds of millions through a mixed public model. It invests heavily in rural revitalization and urban planning. It controls land use to prevent runaway speculation and gentrification. And perhaps most importantly, it maintains control over the commanding heights of the economy. In China, banking, energy, transportation, telecommunications, and natural resources are not left to the market. They are governed as public goods. This prevents monopolies, ensures access, and allows for coordinated national planning. Western analysts often fail to grasp this because their minds are shaped by decades of ideological conditioning. They cannot conceive of a system where markets exist but do not rule, where billionaires exist but are not untouchable, where the state is powerful but not parasitic, where planning is not a relic but a necessity. Yet that is precisely what China has built. And this explains why, despite repeated predictions of collapse, China continues to rise. It is not driven by quarterly earnings. It is not held hostage by hedge funds. It is not governed by lobbyists. It is guided by long-term strategy, national interest, and an explicit commitment to economic sovereignty. And in this system, the stock market is merely a component, not the foundation. In the U.S., politicians celebrate every rise in the Dow Jones as a sign of national success. But in China, the government doesn't even consider the stock market a priority. Why? Because only around 10% of the population is directly exposed to it. Because capital allocation is done through public banks, not Wall Street. Because production, not speculation, is the cornerstone of development. This is not ideology for ideology's sake. It is policy rooted in necessity. And that necessity is increasingly clear as the global system enters a period of profound instability. Supply chains are breaking, inflation is rising, energy prices are volatile, inequality is exploding. Political systems in the West are fragmenting under the weight of their contradictions. Meanwhile, China is preparing for a world beyond unipolarity. It's investing in renewable energy at a scale no other nation can match. It is building continental trade routes across Eurasia and Africa. It is diversifying its partnerships, expanding its technological base, and internationalizing its currency. It is integrating vertically, planning horizontally, and thinking long-term. This is not an accident. It is a consequence of its system, a system that prioritizes the collective over the individual. Stability over speculation, sovereignty over surrender, production over finance, and planning over chaos. So let's return to the core question. Is China capitalist or socialist? The answer is both simple and complex. It is socialist because the commanding heights are publicly owned, because credit is allocated by the state, because economic planning shapes the long-term trajectory, because capital is subordinate to politics, and billionaires do not write the laws. But it is also market-based because the state uses markets as tools, because private enterprise is permitted, even encouraged, in non-strategic sectors. Because competition is used not as a dogma but as a mechanism, tightly managed, frequently disciplined, and always constrained by political authority. This is not capitalism. This is not the free market. This is not the Wall Street model. This is socialism with Chinese characteristics, a term often mocked in the West, but deeply meaningful in its own context. It means that socialism is not a blueprint, is not a frozen doctrine. It is a method of organizing society based on ownership, planning, and public interest, but shaped by historical conditions, national culture, and practical constraints. China does not pretend to export this model wholesale, does not invade countries to install it. It does not claim it is universally applicable. It only insists that it has the right to build it for itself. And that, more than anything, is what threatens the Western order. Because if China can succeed on its own terms, then others will ask, why can't we? Why can't we have public banking? Why can't we have national industrial strategies? Why can't we control housing, transport, and energy for the public good? Why can't we break the stranglehold of financial oligarchs over democracy? Why can't we stop being colonies of capital? These are dangerous questions because they go to the root of power. And power, when threatened, does not go quietly. That is why the United States continues to escalate confrontation with tariffs, sanctions, military encirclement, and ideological warfare. It is not because China threatens democracy. It is because China threatens the myth that capitalism is the only path to prosperity. And in doing so, It opens the door to something bigger, a new era of sovereignty, planning, and multipolar development. That era has not fully arrived. The struggle continues, the contradictions remain, but the ground is shifting. And somewhere in the halls of power from Washington to Brussels, from Tokyo to London, an uncomfortable truth is dawning. China did not abandon socialism. It adapted it, it rebuilt it, and it is winning with it. Not by serving capital, but by subordinating it. Not by mimicking Wall Street, but by neutralizing it. Not by replacing the state with the market, but by putting the market in a cage. So the next time someone tells you that China is capitalist, ask them this. If China is capitalist, why does it control its banking system? Why does it own all the land? Why does it dominate global infrastructure building? Why does it jail corrupt billionaires? Why does it plan its economy every 5 years? Why does it discourage speculation and reward production? And most of all, why does it scare Wall Street? Because that fear says everything. It says that China's system is not just different, it's working, and the empire knows it. If this analysis helped to understand the question, don't forget to like and subscribe the channel to keep thinking the world how it really is.